Hey everybody, I'm Ryan and welcome back to the channel. I'm finally getting around to starting my series on flavor creation when it comes to whiskey. Distillers make so many choices, so many decisions from start to finish during the process of making whiskey, and those decisions drive flavor creation at every stage. From your grains and your ratios to the yeast strain that you choose to use to convert your starches to sugars, to how you handle your mash process, if you're going to use sour mash or setback, and then what kind of still are you going to use to distill your spirit, and what warehouse are you going to store it in, and where in the warehouse are you going to store it. All of those variables drive flavor creation, and it's just so fascinating to me to see how what could otherwise be fairly similar whiskeys, they end up tasting so dramatically different just because of the way that the distiller is tweaking those dials and turning those knobs throughout the flavor creation process. But in today's episode, I know I'm going to go a little bit out of order here, but I wanted to start with the barrel. And I want to do that because everybody always references this rule of thumb that, the majority of the flavor that a whiskey has is imparted to it by the barrel, right? Some people say it's 70% of the flavor of your whiskey comes from the barrel. Some say it's 50%. But regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, it's pretty unanimously understood in the industry that the biggest contributing factor to your whiskey's flavor is the barrel. So let's break down the barrel. Now, I'm going to keep this discussion separate from the topic of warehouse influence because I think warehouse influence is a big deal. I think it deserves its own full episode too. But we'll save that for another day. For now, let's just talk about barrel influence. All right, so we'll try to break this down in a reasonable order. We'll start with the coopering of the barrel and how it's made, to then the charring or the toasting of that barrel, and then ultimately, if any finishing happens or what happens to that barrel after its initial use. But before a barrel is a barrel, it's just a bunch of trees. And I think that's an important place to start. But what trees are we talking about here? Well, by definition, American whiskey has to be aged in virgin oak barrels. Now, Scotch is predominantly aged in ex-bourbon barrels that were used to make bourbon first. But sometimes it's aged in sherry casks or Madeira or port. But either way, it has to be oak by definition to be Scotch. So why oak, you might ask? There's tons of different types of trees out there. There's maples and poplars and pines and cherries. But oak is a very unique kind of wood. On the cellular level, oak has these structures called tyloses. They're basically doorways that only allow certain things through. They'll allow gas and vapor to go through, but they won't allow liquids to pass through. And that's important because we don't want the barrels to leak. And also, the whiskey is the distiller's product. It's their source of revenue. So they don't want to lose any more of it than they absolutely have to. And they do, in fact, lose some of it. Now, you may have heard this sort of romantic term tossed around from time to time called the angel's share. And that term refers to the evaporative loss that the distiller takes when the whiskey evaporates and eventually passes through the tyloses and out of the barrel into the warehouse open air. And if you've ever taken a tour of a warehouse, you know the smell. You're literally bathing in this angel's share as you walk around in that thick air. Now, depending on the climate, the distiller could lose up to, 10% of their whiskey in the barrel due to that evaporative loss if it's hot. But colder climates tend to lose far less, but then in turn, it takes the whiskey a much longer amount of time to fully mature. And that's why I think it's important to ditch this erroneous preconception that age is everything when it comes to whiskey, right? A 16-year-old Scotch must be way better than an 8-year-old bourbon aged half as long, right? Wrong. Distillers will tell you that a whiskey is ready when it's ready. In the colder climates of Scotland, that evaporation and condensation within the barrel, it happens much more slowly over time. So then naturally it takes much longer to fully mature. But then in those hot summers and cool winters in Kentucky, that evaporation and condensation happens much more rapidly with those big temperature fluctuations inside the barrel. So if you were to let it go on for too long, ultimately you would end up with this thick syrup that they couldn't sell because it tastes like garbage. Now, more on that in a second, but quick time out though. If you're enjoying the video so far, could you do me a favor and hit the like button on it, as that's the best free way to support content here on YouTube. Helps the YouTube videos get out there for more people to see and have more reach. So I genuinely appreciate it. And also thanks to my Patreon supporters. I freaking love you guys. But anyways, that's really what's going on in the barrel. The whiskey is going to go into that barrel initially clear. They call it white dog when it comes off the still. When you end up with something like this, ultimately, something changed in that barrel. So the whiskey is then evaporating and condensing, going into the wood, grabbing color, grabbing flavor and then condensing back into the barrel, out and in, out and in, as those temperatures fluctuate in the warehouse. And the oak does have a lot of flavor to offer as well. There are vanillins in the wood that help the whiskey to have this vanilla flavors that it gets out of the wood. And it's an appropriately named thing, those vanillins, because it's predominantly what's used in your like vanilla imitation flavors, right? Your fake vanilla flavorings. And a lot of that stuff that the whiskey is going to pull out of the wood was created long before it was ever in barrel form. So after the trees have been cut into logs, those logs then go to a mill yard and they sit and they wait to be cut into staves. And while they're waiting, they're constantly being hosed down and kept wet. And that water starts to strip the tannins out of the wood and it sort of runs off. And that's good because too many tannins in the wood will lead to a whiskey that tastes like, dry sawdust or a number 2 pencil. But fungus also grows on the logs during that time, and that fungus actually creates more sugars from cellulose and breaks down even more tannins out of the wood. So the wood is basically getting sweeter. And then the logs will be cut into staves and stacked in a drying yard. And this is often referred to as seasoning the wood. As it sits there for several months, it'll season, sometimes even years, depending on the distiller's choices. And during that seasoning time, on a cellular level, the cells of the wood will continue to release more water and moisture and continue to dry out. And even more tannins are lost during that time. So basically all that's left are the sugars and the more palatable, enjoyable oak qualities that can be imparted on the distillate. The things that make like astringent flavors and really dry your mouth out in terms of mouthfeel, those are stripped and gone. Then after that, usually the staves are all kindled to be uniform and have the same level of moisture. That way it's easier for the coopers to work with them. And now it's their turn. And the coopers are some of the most talented craftsmen on the planet as far as I'm concerned. If you've never seen a cooper assemble a barrel, it is a remarkable process. They work almost exclusively by eye, just matching up staves and grabbing them and assembling a barrel. And those staves are steamed so they can be bent more easily and then bound by steel hoops. And all of that bending and shaping is actually breaking down even more lignins in the wood to create more sugars. So it's just constantly getting sweeter and sweeter as we keep working with the wood. So next is the heat. Now the inside of the barrel will either be charred or toasted, and sometimes both. So toasting is much gentler, right? It's a lower heat, longer amount of time, creates flavors like your brown sugars and your gentle oaks. But then charring is much more intense. It's a direct flame right on the wood to char that outer layer and then create this like red layer, they call it the red layer, underneath that. And that char layer serves as a filter, actually, and it also caramelizes a lot of the sugars in the wood, leading to more like caramely, molasses, roasty flavors in your whiskey. Now, the distiller can make choices about what sort of varying degree of char they want in the wood, and there are different levels of char. And they'll make a choice based on how they want their final product to turn out. Now, all bourbon barrels are charred by definition, but sometimes the distiller will ask for it to be toasted first, to toast those outer layers, and then charred afterwards. And that char layer is an important filter. We'll get to that later. But now it's time to fill the barrel. So the distiller now has to choose an entry proof, and they have a tough choice to make. Now, keeping the proof high will save them on barrel costs, right? The more they dilute it, the more barrels they'll have to buy to age the stuff in, because they'll have more liquid ultimately. Now, the entry proof cannot legally be higher than 125 proof, but it's really untraditional to have it that high anyways. So if the distiller wants ultimately a specific proof for a single barrel product, then they have to take that into account when they consider their entry proof. So there's a lot of doing math, a lot of experience, and even sometimes a little bit of guesswork when it comes to ultimately the product you're going to end up with. Now, there are exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking, the first time a barrel, a brand new barrel, is filled with whiskey, it happens in America. Almost no one is using virgin oak barrels for whiskey anywhere else in the world. So Scotch distillers want an American whiskey to strip all the big, bold flavors out of that wood, out of that barrel first, and then they want to use it next to get much gentler and subtler flavors out of that wood now that all the big bold ones have been stripped away. And that will complement their malted barley spirit much better. But American distillers, though, they want to pull out all those vanillas and those caramels and molasses and spice. They want to get all that out of the wood for their product, before they pass it on. And ultimately, that's why American whiskey is much darker in color, more amber sometimes, than, Scotch tends to be, or Irish whiskeys, or Japanese whiskeys, or Canadian whiskeys. Because our whiskey went into that barrel first, and it stripped out a lot more color out of that barrel, and now there's less of that color to be grabbed by the following whiskey. So for comparison's sake, much different colors here between Monkey Shoulder and, well, this is Weller. It's a wheated. Here we go. Here's a good comparison. Here's your Elijah Craig Barrel Proof C922 compared side by side with Monkey Shoulder, a blended Scotch whiskey. This is yellow. This is reddish brown. Very much a lot darker, right? So that red layer underneath the char is adding flavor to the whiskey. So the alcohol continues to break down the lignins in the wood, creating a wide array of flavor compounds in the process that lead to flavors like tobacco, cinnamon, baking spice. And this process of breaking things down in the wood also creates aromatic compounds leading to smells like caramel and various nuts. So while that red layer is constantly adding flavors to the whiskey, the char layer is actually taking flavors away from the whiskey and stripping them. So charcoal is a natural filter, so it can take away any sulfuric flavors that may have made it through the still, or other souring flavors that came through with various congeners in the distillation process. And this process of stripping flavors away is good for the distiller, because when you strip those flavors away, it lets the ones that they want you to taste shine through big and bold without anything else to detract your palate away from them. So over the course of the next however many years, the whiskey in the barrel will continue this round trip into the barrel, grabbing flavors and color, then back into the barrel, into the wood, into the barrel, into the wood, into the barrel. And the alcohol will continue to break down more compounds in the wood, creating even more flavors. And the distiller will sample the barrels as they're aging to keep an eye on them, to know when they're going to be ready, but also to keep an eye out for like special barrels that might be a good fit for like a special release of some kind. And they'll make sure that each barrel is only emptied at just the right time, when it is just right for whatever the end game product is that whiskey is designed for. Now, sometimes that's a 2-year process. If you want to have a bourbon or a rye whiskey that's going to be designed to maybe be a cocktail mixer. Sometimes it's 4 years if you want to have a Kentucky straight bourbon or straight rye that's going to be a decent sipper all on its own, but relatively affordable. Sometimes it's 6 to 8 years. Sometimes it's a 10-year single barrel. Sometimes it's a special release that's 14 years, maybe 10 years, maybe 18 years. So now our whiskey barrel has been used for the first time, and it's ready to be sold and shipped off to Canada, Ireland, Scotland, Japan, or any other country that might be diving into the whiskey business. But we do need to get some terminology down so that when you read the labels, the bottles, you know what the whiskey went through to get to you. It's important to understand that. It gives you some context when you're tasting the whiskey. So if you see the term virgin oak barrel, it simply means a toasted, not charred, never before used oak barrel. If you see the term new charred barrel, then you know that that's like a never before used charred oak barrel, usually used for bourbon and other American whiskeys. And then maybe when you're researching the scotch that you're about to sip, it says it was aged in ex-bourbon barrels. That simply means that the barrel was first used to age bourbon in it, and now it's being used to age your scotch in. And sometimes you'll see a whiskey that says it was finished in ex-sherry barrels or casks. And that's simply same thing as ex-bourbon. It just means a barrel that was first used to age sherry in. And then you might see the term first fill, and it's kind of confusing. It simply means the first time a barrel has been filled after its initial use. So it says first fill. It's technically the second time the barrel has been used. So first fill will be ex-bourbon. It was first used to age bourbon. First fill, now this is the first time that ex-bourbon barrel has been filled. You might see second fill. Again, third time the barrel has been used. Second time it's been filled after its initial use. I know, kind of confusing. So those are the main terms. There are others, but they're usually fairly self-explanatory. Whew. Okay, I know this has been a lot of information, so feel free to take notes and stuff. But the next thing we need to talk about is what kind of oak did these barrels come from? Because each species of oak sort of lends itself to different flavor profiles. So American white oak is the most popular. It's your bourbon barrels, your rye barrels, most of your Scotch barrels, right? Your American oak barrel that was maybe used to age bourbon first. It left behind, it's more subtle now, but it did leave behind some flavors that are unique to American white oak, like your caramel, maybe a little bit of citrus, and definitely vanilla. But if the whiskey is aged in an ex-sherry barrel, then you're actually getting European oak. It's different. You're looking at flavors like chocolate, spices, dried fruits. And for the rest of this oak breakdown, I'm going to be referencing Lou Bryson's work in his book Masterclass. Bam. This is a great read. And Lou Bryson is a whiskey writer and taster, enthusiast, whatever. A lot of good reputation behind his name. I highly recommend this book if you want to understand flavor creation in whiskey. But I'm going to be referencing this as I talk about the flavors that different species of oak impart on a whiskey. So, like I said, the most common type is American white oak. That's your vanilla, citrus, caramel, maybe a little bit of coconut. But then you've got your French oak, Quercus robur. And I actually broke this down recently in a video I did on Nulu because they did an experimental French oak finished bourbon. This one right here, experimental series. This was actually a barrel pick done by the folks over at r/bourbon. They did a great job. But anyways, French oak is called French oak because it largely comes from the area of Limousin in France. It's mostly used for sherry, cognac, port, Madeira. But then many whiskey distillers will then snatch those barrels up because French oak has higher tannins and it leads itself to flavors more like your chocolate, dried fruit, leather, dry tannic oak. And then you've got Hungarian oak, Quercus petraea. And it's not at all common in whiskey barrels, but if you saw it, I wanted you to at least know it was a thing. Lower levels of tannins, lots of aromatics. It'll be a very potent whiskey. But one oak you might hear more about is Oregon oak, Quercus garryana. Now, this type of oak is actually protected, so it's harder to come by, it's more expensive to buy it and use it, but it offers dried fruits, but notably lots of this smoky sweetness, almost like a barbecue sauce is how Lou Bryson breaks it down, and lots of tannins in the wood. So notably, Westland Distillery in Seattle has developed a bit of a reputation for using this kind of oak in their barreling very well. Now, there are other species of oak as well that are sometimes used, but it's so very rarely. I mean, you might see something like Mizunara oak from Japan, but the chances are you won't be tasting them anytime soon. And if you are, it's probably because you're an enthusiast hunting them down and you've got the coin for it, in which case you probably already know what you're getting. Woo! Okay, I know that's been a lot of information, y'all. But I really wanted you to understand the different factors that go into flavor creation as far as the barrel is concerned. From the type of oak, to the length of the time it's seasoned for how much heat you expose it to with the toasting and the charring, to the length of time spent in that barrel, and then to the barrel's maybe journey across the oceans to different countries for another use. Right? I wanted you to understand all of those things. And one analogy that's really frequently used is the tea bag analogy, where they say a barrel is like a tea bag. The more times you use it, the less flavor it's going to impart on your tea. And a barrel is like that. The first time you use it for your bourbon, big, bold flavors. Every time after that, it gets exponentially less and less and less over time until the barrel is eventually retired. And that's all up to the distiller to decide how much impact they want the barrel to have on their spirit. I hope you found this helpful and informative. Thanks as always for tuning into the channel, and I hope that you learned something new. And if you enjoyed this video, then please feel free to leave a like on it and subscribe for additional whiskey content. Thanks again to all my Patreon supporters. I really appreciate you guys. So be warm and well fed, my friends. May you live richly and get better with age. Cheers.